you very much, and aloha to everyone joining this webinar. I am Richard Vuylsteke, the president of the East-West Center, and I will heartily welcome you all to today's East-West Center Insights webinar on a set of very important and timely topics. We're all aware of the many challenges now confronting the people of the Pacific Islands, especially climate change and COVID-19 pandemic. These make the need for regional cooperation and community solidarity greater than ever. Last month, on March 25th, the East-West Center hosted a virtual workshop called Strengthening Resilience, Cooperation, and Partnership in the Pacific. The purpose of the workshop was to promote collaboration among nations and within communities to meet such challenges. We were honored and pleased to hold the workshop in partnership with the government of Japan. We convened a select group of experts from Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Pacific Islands countries, and the United States, all with expertise in regional dynamics, compound climate threats, and disaster recovery mechanisms, all pertinent to the region. Here with me today, virtually, we are holding the workshops kind of follow up with the workshop's co-leaders back in March, Dr. Victoria Keener and Dr. Satu Limaye. And Satu joins us from Washington. Victoria is here in Honolulu, and we have people on this call from Asia clear to the East Coast of the United States. Victoria and Satu will take us through some of the key issues discussed at that workshop last month. Let me just give a brief introduction for the people who will be talking with each other about how that workshop went and follow-up activities and things that have happened pertinent to those discussions. First of all, Dr. Victoria Keener is a senior research fellow at the East-West Center and the co-lead principal investigator of the Pacific Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or for short, which we always use as Pacific RISA. That program is funded by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration of the United States. Dr. Limaye is Vice President of the East-West Center and Director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative and a whole spectrum, full platter of other activities in our Washington office. We are delighted that they both made time today to join us for this discussion. And again, welcome the audience to hear their insights on not only the webinar previously, but subsequent activities that are relevant to those topics. I'd like to kick off with a question to Victoria Keener and then let the two top scholars here talk with each other about the host of issues touched upon by the workshop last month. So an open question really. So last week at the Leaders Summit on Climate, the Biden administration made a commitment to reduce U.S. emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. That is a greater amount of reductions and 20 years sooner than had been previously stated. So my question is, how are the Pacific Islands involved in the Leaders Summit? And what are the implications for the region in the next decades, especially as we look at climate change and emissions issues? Over to you, Victoria.
Thanks, President Vuylsteke, and thanks to the East-West Center Insights Program for the opportunity to do this today. So why don't we start out with touching on exactly what the Leaders Summit on Climate was and why it really built so nicely upon the themes that we talked about in our workshop last month. So the main themes we really discussed there were regional cooperation in the Pacific, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and different adaptation and collaboration strategies that were being implemented across the region. So what the summit was, it took place 1 week ago, and what it did was reconvene the US-led Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate. So what that does is bring together 17 countries that are responsible for about 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as global GDP. So the President Biden also invited the heads of other countries that were demonstrating strong climate leadership or were especially vulnerable to climate impacts. and this is going to be used as a key milestone on the road to the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26 this November in Glasgow. So President Kabua of the Marshall Islands was the only Pacific Island representative officially at the Leaders Summit. As the administration has previously said, the summit was targeted at the larger emitter countries, but the Marshall Islands has shown quite a bit of leadership in the Pacific and globally in terms of looking at advocacy for mitigating the impacts of climate change. So the Biden administration outcomes really show that they're using the 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature increase as their primary goal, a target which was also led by Pacific Islanders and islanders globally through their advocacy and work at the international level. And there was, again, very strong leadership for Micronesia. And so at the first day of the summit, the prime ministers of the US, or prime ministers of Japan and Canada announced new climate targets, and the Biden administration submitted its new nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are taking a huge step, an ambitious new 2030 target of cutting greenhouse gases 50 to 52% below 2005 levels, which is quite an increase over what they had previously committed to, but it falls short of what's been calculated to be needed to be compatible with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree increase, which is decreasing by 57 to 63% those greenhouse gases. But it really does show the urgency and the practical ways of what we're going to need to do within the region to address some of these issues.
Right, well, maybe I'll pick up from here. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Richard, and EWC for the opportunity. Of course, thank you to the Consulate of Japan for funding the seminar in March, and all the participants who gave such thoughtful and incisive remarks at that time. So we're kind of building on those, borrowing from those, channeling some of those. So I hope you'll forgive our mistakes and our own assessments. I'd like to just sort of flag 3 or 4 things. First, the seminar that we did on the Pacific regionalism and the implications for environmental and climate change response took place approximately a month or so after a very significant event in the region, which was the sort of, if you will, for lack of a better phrase, the breakdown of the Pacific Island Forum process, in which Micronesian states decided that their candidate had not been elected and chose subsequent actions to depart from the forum, including leaving an embassy in Suva, Fiji, et cetera. So that's one element I'd like to flag, because and I'll try to link it to the wonderful comments of Victoria. We're now meeting in the context of 2 things that happened last week, and one, in fact, earlier this week. So we couldn't have picked this timing. Many of these were surprises, but she's already, Victoria's touched wonderfully on what was decided and the significance of the climate summit held last week. And I think that's really important. And the third is that a process of, if for the lack of a better word again, is reconciliation has begun through what is called a Troika Plus process between the Pacific Island Forum and the Micronesian leaders. And that began on Monday. So for those who want to know exactly what's going to happen, stay tuned, because next meeting is planned for May, and there's a lot more to come. What's the nexus between this issue of Pacific regionalism, climate change, environment, and next steps on both? I think 3 things I'd flag. First, in a fundamental way, and Victoria and I were discussing this earlier, because she's a climate expert, always corrects my misunderstandings and mistakes. But basically, without the big emitters in the world that were invited to the summit and the big commitments that have been made, at least declaratory wise, we cannot have a solution to the climate change and major environmental issues. Secondly, logically follows, those are critical for the Pacific Island states, because the Pacific Island states, whatever wonderful things they do, whether through indigenous means, technical means, assistance from other countries, cannot by themselves address climate change if the big emitters don't. The nexus and why Pacific regionalism is so important and fundamental to this discussion is because in some sense, Pacific regionalism and Pacific unity on climate change for decades has created the benchmarks to which countries are now beginning to declare their commitment and support. So that's the fusion between Pacific regionalism, climate change commitments, and the three vectors of the breakdown of the PIF summit and the questions about future regionalism and next steps on the climate change front. And what we have to address, I hope, today is, so what now? Given the developments at the Pacific Island Forum and this Troika process for reconciliation, what are the next steps in Pacific regionalism and how do they bear on what the Pacific Islands themselves do? Let us leave aside US, China, India for the moment. What will they do and how will regionalism shape their next steps on adaptation resilience? So let me leave it there for now as introductory comments for setting up a framework for discussion. And happy to engage with Victoria and Richard and others as we go along.
Thanks for that context, Satu. Yeah, I was thinking that one of the things that we've really seen, we talked about at the conference, and we've seen, not just since Micronesia withdrew from the PIF, but before that as well, is that when it comes to these big issues that the Pacific Islands is strong on, representing at the international level. So things like climate action and advocacy, looking at greenhouse gas mitigation, making commitments and targets, as well as things like biodiversity conservation and blue economy, things like that. Even with these political disagreements, the countries really seem to come together and be consistently collaborating when it comes to acting on climate change and adapting and looking at how to go forward. So it's really, these political disagreements, while very important at some scales, are not preventing adaptation work from going forward in the region. And that's something that we really discussed in the panels at the workshop as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Victoria, because, when you read the newspapers, there's clearly a political dissonance going on between Micronesia and Melanesia and Polynesia to some extent. And if you look at the composition of the Troika, for example, you'll see that it's a very interesting structure for reconciliation. It's the past chair of the PIF, the current chair, and next year's chair. So I'll get it wrong, of course, but I think it's Tuvalu, Fiji, and Nauru. And Nauru, of course, playing the current role, and also PNG and Samoa included as well as the 5 presidents of Micronesia. Now, why that's important, I think, is reiterates the point that there's a real, and if you look at the statement by the Pacific Islands Forum on what the apology, they framed it in family terms. I mean, if you look at that statement, it's for those of you who follow Pacific regionalism, I guess this language is familiar. For those of us who work on other regionalisms in East Asia and more broadly, to speak about family, to use that statement and the breakdown in the family and to apologize in a public statement on behalf of the forum, I think is quite interesting. How that relates to climate change, I think is 2 or 3 things I'd flag. One is, not only is the reconciliation process going on in this Troika and Troika Plus process. Second, as Victoria says, that dissonance and disagreement doesn't necessarily imperil or implicate the rest of cooperation in Pacific regionalism in other venues, whether that be South Pacific elements or the Forum Fisheries, or a whole bunch of organizations, depending on how you count what constitutes Pacific regionalism. And in fact, some of the Micronesian leaders have made it very clear that they intend to stay in those other regional organizations, regardless of what happens on the PIF front. And the third is the ongoing work of allies, partners, friends of the region continue both bilaterally and multilaterally, not to mention the indigenous and national efforts on the part. And one commentator at our conference, I thought, made a very interesting point that one of the issues about regionalism and why it's important for the Pacific is it has the networks and sustained capacity that allows the region to address some of these issues. And any breakdowns in that capacity and network would be prejudicial, but they're not happening despite the difference. And I think that's an important point I just underlined.
Yeah, I can do a little bit of an example. I can provide an example on how countries are continuing to collaborate, and I think this is a nice one in terms of especially responding to the Leaders Summit and both mitigation actions and adaptation actions that are going to be going on in the Pacific Islands, and how that relates to the potential release of the Biden administration's infrastructure bill, which is going to be an opportunity for a lot of Pacific Island partners to really shore up their adaptation and infrastructure. So, what we mean when we talk about that huge decrease in greenhouse gas emissions practically in the region is that it's going to mean a major overhaul of global and local energy grids. It means transforming transportation, personal transportation, public, airline travel, military. And what I'm going to touch on now in terms of collaboration is ocean cargo transport. So something that we actually saw last month was that the governments of the Marshall Islands and the Solomon Islands came together to submit a proposal to the IMO's Marine Environmental Protection Committee, which called for a $100 a ton tax on ships' CO2 emissions. And so this is really recognizing that, shipping and cargo transport in the Pacific Islands is such a source of emissions. And so this is really the governments and communities in the Pacific Islands working together to say, we realize that although we are small emitters in terms of greenhouse gases on a global scale, that we are part of these industries that are still emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, and we're coming together to start proposing a solution through a tax on it.
Victoria, on that, let me ask. I mean, it's unclear to me after listening to the president last night here in the United States, talking about the plans, talking about the expenditures. It's not clear to me yet how much and when and for what the money flows to the Pacific Islands. Simultaneously, you have the compacts process going on in terms of 2022 and 23. So you have one line, which is, yes, the US has a big infrastructure plan. Yes, it has these new, even more serious, if you will, commitments to climate change. But I don't know yet if the mechanisms for how we get that infrastructure and financing there. The second thing I just put on the table, because I'd love to hear your views how this nexus fits, quite apart from the regionalism climate change nexus, there's this COVID economic decline nexus. And that is going to be longer term or short term, depending on how Pacific Island countries are weaved into these bubbles, Tasman bubble and smaller bubbles within the Pacific, et cetera. But right now, the situation on COVID and economic decline is quite serious. How do you see that playing into national resiliency and adaptation? Just given simply, one hears all kinds of figures about a 20% decline in GDP for Fiji, and it's got an election next year. And how do these fit together, quite apart from the regionalism?
Yeah, and of course we touched on some of this with our panelists at the workshop as well. So there are, I guess, first to talk about, how are Pacific Islands and other groups going to access some of the infrastructure funding? And like you said, I don't think there's a way that has been decided going forward yet. It's still very much in development. But the two things that, of course, we need to consider are, one, the COFA, Compact of Free Association, that will be renegotiated in the next few years, and also the COVID recovery. So in the conference, we talked about some of the COVID impacts across the region on these different economies. And we're talking about a Lowy Institute study from Australia showing the economic hit that the Pacific region has taken, despite remaining largely COVID-free in a lot of areas, although there have been ups and downs recently. But part of the Lowy Institute statistics were that a massive investment of about $3.5 billion is going to be needed to recover the Pacific Islands region to pre-pandemic levels. But what our experts noted was that a lot of that money should really be focused on capital investments so that we're promoting climate resistant infrastructure and social safety nets as well. But when this investment of $3.5 billion and where it comes from, it's still going to be decided, and that's just to recover over the next 10 years. But the ability to mesh it with climate recovery and infrastructure, I think, is where it's going to be really strategic to fit in with the forthcoming bill out of the Biden administration.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I've been wondering myself, when you have a 20%, say, contraction in a particular economy, or 10% or 15%, it's quite easy to speak about capital infrastructure for longer term issues like, they're not particularly longer term, but near term issues like climate change in the Pacific. On the other hand, there are also immediate issues of, literally sustenance, food, payments to people to continue restarting schools, what have you. So, there's always that balance. So I was wondering how the Pacific Islands is going to deal with that, because as far as I can see, that may be the COVID and the economic impacts of COVID and the difficulties in reintegration. Now, colleagues that I've spoken to prior to this, in preparation for this, say that at least, for example, in some cases like Australia and others, they found ways to maintain seasonal worker programs, which are, of course, an important source of remittances. As we well know, in the United States, at least in Micronesia and the freely associated states, there's been a huge Office of Insular Affairs, Office of Insular Affairs funding post-COVID for a range of programs to assist with recovery and resilience. But these are still going to be huge impacts, and I just wonder whether there's the bandwidth. Not to mention, one of the issues, as you'll recall, we discussed was what's the role of external players. And Australia is heavily committed, New Zealand's heavily committed, the United States is heavily committed, Japan is heavily committed. But there may be, some constraints and ceilings on other partners being able to give the kind of funding and attention as they themselves are dealing with COVID responses. So those are some of the factors I think will play out as well on this.
Yeah, another one that really goes across all of those things that you mentioned and that we talked about as well in some of the panels at the workshop was, not just the role of collaboration, but the role of coordination. So when we're seeing all of this money come from potentially Australia, New Zealand, Japan, US, being put in to these climate adaptation and mitigation commitments, what we don't want to see is an alphabet soup of agencies just pouring money in a non-strategic way, which has happened before. And that within a region where human resources are limited, time is very important in terms of agencies holding redundant workshops, a day apart, being different countries or different agencies within the same country being on an island, doing something, accessing the same group of experts and stakeholders in country that are really, taxing their ability to meaningfully engage. And so I think something else that's going to be really important is building meaningful partnerships around these initiatives and coordinating across countries and across agencies in a way that gives as much agency as possible to the Pacific Islands that are being worked with.
Well said. And yet, you know, as a person who's worked for decades and has expertise in the region, it's not always easy to coordinate. And this is
I love to say that, but it's much harder to do.
It's much harder to do, as we know, and it's certainly not unique to the Pacific Islands. We hear this all over the world. I mean, and particularly since this initial workshop in March, as we've said at the outset, was supported by Japan. I'm conscious, having worked the U.S.-Japan alliance issue, the U.S.-Japan issue, that coordination in Southeast Asia, or South Asia for that matter, I mean, there are bits and pieces. There's some good examples. There's some fine work on both sides. But it's difficult. And there are different systems, different pots of money, different color of money, different agendas, different objectives, different authorities. And it's really tough to disentangle that. And I'm sort of underlining this for a reason. There's an objective here. And that is to say, this is one area where I do think that the breakdown of the PIF may have implications. And they're sort of cross-cutting. And I will be very frank and say, I haven't come to what might be called a net assessment. But here's the dynamic, and here's the argument. On the one hand, the Pacific is attracting more and more attention of a number of major states, right, around the world. We all know. US, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, India, EU, etc. On the other hand, that very attention is difficult to coordinate. And because of the fissure or the dissonance in the PIF, it may well be that these external powers begin to, rather than coordinate across the region, move into their normal bandwidths, or more traditional or comfortable bandwidths. So that would mean the US and Japan primarily in Micronesia. I'm not suggesting only, I'm suggesting traditionally, if you look at the data flows and empirical flows, it's in the North Pacific. Australia in its near areas of Melanesia in particular, New Zealand in Polynesia. So do you think that, how do we deal with this? Because this seems to me one of the things we're already seeing. It's inevitable. There are pressures on resources. There is this fissure. It's natural and easy because of the connections, proximities, traditions, histories. Some of these places for New Zealand are realm associations, so they have legal obligations. How do we manage this?
Yeah, great question. Luckily for me, I'm a climate scientist, not a political scientist, so I get to say that's
so you get to punt. You get to punt on this stuff.
But you know what I can comment on. One of the panels in the workshop was really talking about the strengths that Pacific Islanders and governments bring to recovery processes, not just for the pandemic, but also natural disasters and these compounding events. And what we heard again and again from panelists was that in the Pacific Islands, the key currency is relationships. You know, that is how things get done and accomplished, and that is how recovery is made. But you know, this we saw it the primacy of relationships in full effect in the Pacific Islands Forum when with the withdrawal of Micronesia, potentially because they weren't able to be there in person to talk with each other and work it out. But we also saw strengths that were brought up during the panel discussion in the conference around how relationships in the Pacific Islands are allowing communities to either stay afloat or grow. So, you know, we heard about the role of Indigenous knowledge and principles of positive peace building in local and regional recovery in Pacific Islands. And that, you know, this goal of equitable policy transformation is a long-term target that requires that bottom-up engagement from the communities and community building to really push for changes at the top down. We also heard about different bright spots of community collaboration in Hawaii and around the Pacific Islands region in general, really talking again about that primacy of relationships and promoting equitable recovery on the most impacted groups. So,
Right.
what we see again and again in the region is that one of the strengths that Pacific Islanders bring is that use of relationships to build each other up, and that's going to be strong as we go forward.
Yeah, that's a good reminder of the point that was brought up about, the many reasons. There's a, quite significant debate in the analytical community about what exactly happened, who was responsible for what, but certainly that issue of not being able to be there in person and have a virtual call, and therefore not the sideline discussions, the nuances, the personal bonding that occurs normally in such sessions all over the world, but certainly in the Pacific in particular, couldn't take place, and therefore they were focused on this election, and it became quite narrow and kind of isolated from the rest of the relationship. That's a good point. The second thing I just flag, and this came up at our session, and I want to flag it because it sort of builds on what you had reminded us of, that there are other models. I mean, if we are in a model in between this reconciliation process on the PIF, meanwhile, these other extant organizations that will continue their work and Micronesia will remain part of. One of our Japanese colleagues, in fact, suggested a kind of layered multilateralism using very selective bilateral efforts that privilege relationships, exactly what you said, with their respective areas or historical relationships in the first instance, and then building on that in sort of coalitional ways. And I thought that was very intriguing because if you can't get pan unity, sometimes it's useful to do the best you can from the community level, combined with some targeted bilateral relationships and layered multilateralism or functional multilateralism that can help achieve the same ends, especially while a reconciliation process. Now, everyone's question, and it's come up often, is, how long does this reconciliation process take? This Troika Plus process, as I understand it, the first meeting was on the 26th, on April 26th. I guess that was a Monday. The next one is scheduled for May. I understand the next PIF meeting is in August. I do not know what date. Someone on this call perhaps knows exactly what date it's scheduled. It does seem to me that could be a timeline for making some sort of reconciliation in the PIF process. And certainly climate change won't be addressed, and all of those steps won't be taken between now and August. So I think that will be something to watch out for. I'm conscious of our time, Victoria. I know you're keeping time, and maybe our colleagues and Richard. So I do want to make sure that we're not running over and giving chance for folks to have questions or comments from the floor. And I don't remember exactly what time. I think we have some 8 minutes or 7 minutes left, but please.
Maybe
7 minutes. Okay.
7 minutes left. All right, 7 minutes before question and answers. So hopefully we have some.
Or we can go to them early too, if we wish.
Yeah, I'm actually fine with that if we want to. I think we hit on most of our main points.
Okay.
Maybe just the last thing I'll throw in there before we open it up to more general discussion or questions from the audience is that, when you're talking about these more specific one-on-one country engagements to, that was brought up during the panel by our Japanese colleagues to really add some collaborative ties and increase that network. And, that's in a way kind of the redundancy of the network. You want to create as many ties as possible so that there are always these lines. And this goes back to how a lot of these environmental issues really seem to bypass a lot of this, a lot of the politics. Mm-hmm. Is we heard about the Pacific Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, or Pacific RISC, which is really looking at region-wide international strategies for addressing biosecurity and invasive species movement across the region, and how climate change might impact that. And so we've, part of this recognizes that the interacting effects of climate change and biodiversity loss, are so apparent within the Pacific Islands ecosystems and our livelihoods are entwined with those. So the more we can collaborate to establish different strategies to address it, the better. But that's just another way that, that's another mechanism by which countries are coming together to continue working on these big issues outside of the purely political negotiation process.
Well, great. Shall we go to the Q&A? I think Richard is going to be handling that. There he is. And you say the word and there he appears. So thank you. Perfect timing, Richard.
Here's the word.
Yeah, there we go.
First of all, I just want to, Victoria, you and Satu, we could listen to you a lot longer because it's a great conversation. And for those of people who were fortunate enough to tune in to the workshop last month, you can see how stimulating that workshop was, not only in the content that was presented, but also the ideas that are not dying on the vine, but I want to get more and more important and more awareness. And so, Victoria and Satu, you've really touched on a lot of the main themes that came up in that workshop and shows their long shelf life, so to speak, as issues. We do have some good questions, and I'm going to start with at the top here. This one is really concerns women's roles. Okay, so the question is, thinking about the role of women's voices in the climate change discourses, what do you think is the impact on the Pacific with the election of the first female U.S. Vice President, Kamala Harris, both in terms of U.S. policy and secondly on empowering women's voices in the Pacific in these discourses? So I'll let you, whoever wants to start with that one, go for it.
Want me to start?
Sure, why not?
Okay. So, I think that's a great question that really brings together a lot of the different themes that we talked about as well, and a lot of the community bottom-up work being done in both environmental advocacy and climate advocacy in the Pacific Islands is in fact led by women's groups, either specifically or generally women leaders throughout the Pacific. And I think that we are seeing a lot more meaningful engagement across the region in terms of women's empowerment and climate environment issues. In terms of the impact on the Pacific of the election of the first female U.S. Vice President Harris, I'm not exactly sure. That's something that I would love to hear more from different voices in the region. But I can also say that, in terms of advocacy, a lot of the youth groups that have really come out globally and in the Pacific to advocate for stronger climate action have been led by women, young women, very, very young women, teenagers that are leading these movements. And I've been, most impressed in the last couple of years with the emergence of these movements and young women leaders globally coming out. And I think that has been very effective at, these youth movements led by young women at pushing top-down change from not just the Biden administration, but around the world. So I think that we're already seeing some of the results of women's leadership and advocacy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, Richard, that, first of all, there are many women leaders in the Pacific of global stature. I mean, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum until 2 months ago, was Dame Meg Taylor. We've had presidents of countries from the Pacific who've been women. So women's leadership is either at the community level or at the topmost political authorities of the countries of the region is not new. Second of all, I wouldn't at all limit it to the role of women in climate change, particularly. All of the data and economic development studies show repeatedly and empirically that incorporating women into every aspect of education, development, vocation, employment is systemically good. I mean, it's not, forget the moral element here, for just if we can just lay it aside. Obviously we can't and shouldn't, but as a practical matter, whether it's microloans or women's education or women's access to healthcare or family or environmental protection, there are studies that show that women's empowerment and women's role is fundamental to making progress on those issues, which dovetails exactly with what Victoria has said, which is that women have played a leading role in these issues. And it would be disastrous, in my view, to not further solidify those opportunities, training, capacity building, to give even more women a chance to be engaged in this. Otherwise, I think it would be a net moral and practical loss.
Thank you. Thank you. Great answer. And I'm happy to say from the East-West Center perspective, our board met last week, and our newest board member for our governing board of the East-West Center is former president of RMI, Marshall Islands, Dr. Hilda Heine. So we are walking the talk here at the East-West Center too. We got some great questions here. Let me go to the next one. There was quite a bit of comment in both of your discussions earlier about collaboration and coordination. And so we have a question to maybe ask for a little bit deeper dive on that. The question is, there's a lot of movement right now around increasing U.S. federal engagement and investment in the Pacific Islands. What are good strategies for expanding meaningful collaboration on climate change adaptation in the region? And I think another question that goes along that line is, were there lessons learned on coordination, for example, from previous experience, good or bad, that would make that process even more effective?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. I'll start, I guess, and then pass it over to you, Satu. We touched on some of it with talking about the critical nature of better coordination in terms of deploying resources and into the region and for climate change or for any sort of big money movements. But I think the biggest way to engage here is to listen to what Pacific Island countries have been saying for decades, which is that both leaders and communities have been saying that climate change is their number one concern. And so they've repeatedly stated that this is where they want to engage meaningfully with a lot of the big emitter countries. And what we saw in the past administration was that the needed leadership and those big federally led initiatives were very challenging to implement or impossible to implement. But what we also see as we're going forward is that maybe over the last 10 years, the physical science and modeling portion of climate change has really advanced to the point where we have a lot of information, we have a lot of physical climate projections. And what we're trying to do now is how to apply what we've learned from physical science and take action across different sectors and use social science. So really, how do these changes impact different sectors like agriculture, economy, freshwater supply, coastal infrastructure, the blue economy, looking at different ocean impacts. So how do we take that and apply it in a social science context? And so I think now meaningful engagement in the region means moving from that pure science and modeling to dealing with impact science and how to actually implement adaptation on the ground.
Satu?
Right. Well, thank you. I'm not obviously a climate change expert, so I'm going to address the federal element of this and the greater attention element, because I think that's contextually really important to support what Victoria is doing on climate change, adaptation, resilience, and other elements. Look, let's be very frank here. There is not a time that I can remember in the last 70 years, perhaps in the early 80s, when the Soviets were particularly active in the Pacific, that we have had such a robust federal new engagement in the Pacific. Now, that is not to say we have not been persistently engaged. And there have been blips and waxes and wanes and ebbs and flows. But overall, in the last 2-3 years, it is quite significant. What are the drivers? First, there are new federal elements at work here, such as the Honoring Oceania Act by Senator Schatz and other colleagues. There is the Blue Pacific Act in the House of Representatives with Mr. Representative Case and his colleagues in the brand new established, maybe a year old or roughly, give or take, new Pacific Islands Caucus in the House of Representatives. Thirdly, there is the imperative to address the expiring compacts through 22 and 23. So that's a legal issue. That's an American states issue. It's a federal issue. It's a Department of Interior issue and an Office of Insular Affairs issue. So those are three what I would call drivers at the federal level of this increased and expanded engagement. I think now that you've seen Samantha Power taking over at USAID, I think you'll see a bit more on USAID's role. We can expect as well as part of the outgoing process. And then we must be cognizant of two other tensions. And this picks up where Victoria left off. The priority given to climate change in the Pacific is real. It's fundamental. But that is not the only priority at the federal level or amongst our partners and allies or globally. And we must be conscious that issues related to climate change, Blue Pacific, which will be critical and fundamental to the needs and priorities of the region, will have to coexist with other priorities of geopolitics, of diplomacy, of security, of alliance management, and of money. So as these two major bills go forward, Senate and House, I haven't a clue how they will proceed and what time frame exactly and with what variations and amendments, but they will proceed. The compacts, in my estimation, will get done. And that will be a big new federal authorization and appropriations for the Pacific. But one worry, and it's important to express it to have a sound, fair, honest discussion, is these ebbs and flows come and go. And situations change. And so one of the things we really have to look forward to and to plan for, I think, very systematically, is how to sustain this engagement and how to make it reasonable and viable rather than, as Victoria cautioned us, everybody coming in and overtaxing the system, flooding capacity and capability for what in development economics sometimes called absorption capacity, right? So I think we need to look at that carefully. And I think those are things I would flag as we look forward on the federal front.
Can I add one more comment there? And that is on one more piece of legislation that's in the House right now that could also be relevant, as it included, in addition to those other two you mentioned, Satu. And that's the Insular Areas Climate Change Act. And so that was recently introduced last month in the House. And that is actually both a infrastructure and energy funding, as well as coordination mechanism across different federal agencies. So I think it's Department of Energy, NOAA. Of course, now I'm going to blank on the others, but I think there's a third one as well, maybe two more. But
that's great. I didn't know about that one. That's terrific.
Yeah. So that was introduced last month, I believe, and it really is a coordination mechanism, I think, at its heart to deliver those funds. So that's actually relevant to the question you asked earlier of, how might some of those infrastructure funds get out into the region? And although a lot of it concentrates on energy, I think that there are a lot of other ways in which it could be utilized as well. So not just energy, but also, that we talk about the water energy nexus. So how energy and water link to each other. You can use it on things like water systems as well, and providing a lot of capacity that in natural resource management and conservation that islands are very interested in.
Right. To that point, we had a session yesterday at the center that meets that nexus one more: water, energy, and food, looking at Mekong river. We look at coastal seas and so forth. Use of water. There's a lot of context for the things we're talking about. And to Satu's point of putting, you might say, the competition for attention in the White House and other places for all the things that have to be guided and considered. We have another little different angle on the next question, which I think touches on something we have not talked about, which is the broader context of the Pacific Ocean going farther north, and also the role of indigenous knowledge. The question is, please discuss relationships across or along the Pacific Rim, in particular the inclusion or exclusion of Alaskan kinspeople in these dialogues. And that is in line actually with our annual conference on North Pacific Arctic affairs, where we always include indigenous people who are the first warning sign of things going wrong with the environment, with the indigenous knowledge, and whether it's in fisheries or what have you, as a resource for knowledge. So how does that fit into your discussion in this context?
That is a great question. And I think it largely brings up this idea of false boundaries. We're always slicing things different ways. Who's Pacific Island, who's Asian, who's Pacific Rim, it's so in the Pacific, a lot of it is determined by where the funding source is coming from. So, for example, in my NOAA grants, we're authorized to work in or funded to work in US affiliated Pacific Islands. And so, that's a very specific definition. When we work more internationally in the region, often we don't engage as heavily with French Polynesia as we like to. And of course, there's a language barrier that is hard, but often, when we talk about Pacific Islands, French Polynesia isn't present at the table. And in terms of Alaskan kinspeople, we do actually have some projects that include colleagues and stakeholders in Alaska as well, and look at some of these issues. But in terms of climate impacts, when we're doing climate work, we're dealing with very different problems. So a lot of times we can learn across different sectors about things that have gone right, but when we're looking at very specific climate impacts, they don't necessarily transfer seamlessly, although a lot of the strategies do. And networking across the region is, of course, something that we need to do more of so we can learn better from each other. But at the federal level in the US, I know that there are programs that bring together Indigenous voices across the country in terms of representation at the US National Climate Assessment and things on that level.
I'm happy to just put a little footnote on that too. At the East West Center itself, of course, thanks to our increase in federal funding, we were able to build out more our Pacific Islands Development Program, which covers the whole region of the Pacific Islands, but also that also joins other leadership programs and so forth we do in the Pacific, like our Pacific Island Leadership Program, sponsored by Taiwan. And also, we're looking at closer collaboration, to your points about the whole region, various kinds of networks looking at climate and sustainable development goals. We're going to be working much closer with Hawaii Green Growth. We have a joint kind of position already with Pacific RISA and HDG in the works. Our arts program is also looking at indigenous knowledge, but as it relates to expressing knowledge about climate change and so forth. So there's a lot of things going on at the center that I think would be remiss of me not to mention because of the importance of it all. I think we've got time for at least one more question here. So I'm going to take this one here. It says, we are already 2 years into what has been called the climate decade, in which we need to act to address climate change in order to prevent the worst impacts from happening. In your opinion, what are the most critical actions for Pacific Islands to do to meet these goals in the remaining 8 years?
Yeah, thank you for that question as well. So it's kind of this climate decade concept kind of shadows over everything that we do. And I think this idea, so for people that aren't familiar with it, the climate decade, which refers to this decade, refers to the actions that we really have to take sooner rather than later in this decade in order to try and keep the amount of temperature increase globally to 1.5 degrees C. And while setting goals and measuring progress is essential to accomplishing a lot of these adaptation and mitigation goals, I think it's important to realize that what we achieve between now and then by the end of this decade, those are still going to make things better. And these impacts and results are on a continuum. So it's not to say that if we don't meet every goal that that we're setting out this decade, it's going to be some apocalypse scenario. Anything that we can do is going to make things better, and it is a continuum of action. So how I think, and also any action is better than the path that we've been on, which is really keeping things the same and business as usual. But critical actions for Pacific Islands, I think, are to keep advocating and move to implementation of adaptation in different sectors that are the most vulnerable, and that's going to depend on the island in question. And moving to adaptation, recognizing that some of these impacts, no matter what we do, are already baked in to what we've done by the gases we've already emitted.
Satu, comments or closing comment on that?
No. I would absolutely defer to Victoria on this. This is her expertise, and I think she made a very eloquent statement of what needs to be done and what is being done. So that's terrific.
Well, we are reaching the end of our allotted time, much to, I think, everyone's disappointment. It's been a really rich discussion. I want to thank Victoria, you and Satu for staying engaged and in a constructive way. I hope that our audience has had an opportunity to learn some new things and to also consider in more depth some of the topics that were raised up in the workshop we did last month. I do want to say that we talk about collaboration and cooperation, that this workshop was sprung from collaboration with the government of Japan. And we really appreciated their interest in the region and what the center is. We worked with a lot of programs, both in Washington, D.C. and here in Honolulu. But it's the kind of collaboration we're looking at for across the region with other larger countries who are working in the region, hoping that we at the East West Center can really play a role in that more successful collaboration and coordination. So I just want to close by thanking again, formally, Victoria and Satu for their insights, their hard work on these issues, and quite evidently their dedication to their resolution as much as an individual can do. So goodbye and thank you for joining us. Mahalo. And we stay tuned to a whole series of East West Center programs on these and related topics, hosted both here in Honolulu and by my good colleague in Washington, Satu. A good morning, evening, afternoon, good night to you all, and we'll see you next time. Aloha.